Hello, my lovely anatomist and physiologist, Michele Glass here. And we're still talking about our central nervous system, but we're moving out of the brain and down into the spinal cord. So the spinal cord is going to be a cone-shaped 3D structure. So I'm going to draw here a cone shape. So just thinking like an ice cream cone will be perfect. And this is running through the vertebral foramen of the vertebral column. And so we do name the regions of our spinal cord after the regions of the vertebral column. So if you remember at the top, we will have the cervical region of both the vertebral column and the spinal cord. And then we have moving down the thoracic region. And then moving down, we have the lumbar region. And then that's going to end with our sacral region. Now, the thing that's important to pay attention to here is our spinal cord is going to grow for the first like 1 to 4 years of our life, meaning like elongating and making those connections, and then it stops growing in length. So what that means is the spinal cord that we have in our bodies right now is basically like the same length as when we were like 4, maybe a little younger, right? But your vertebral column has more than likely continued to increase in length, right? You're more than likely longer, taller than you were at around age 4. And so what we see is that this spinal cord is not extending from the top to the bottom of the vertebral column. Instead, it's ending. So we call this endpoint the conus medullaris. And it's ending between L1 and L2 of our vertebral column. So that would be, remember, the lumbar region of the vertebral column. So even though our spinal cord has a cervical, thoracic, lumbar, and sacral region, it's maybe not located in those regions of the vertebral column as an adult. So that can be important for us to pay attention to. The spinal cord is part of the central nervous system, as we've said, and so we will see both processing or integrating of information occurring here, and we also see a lot of transmission. So the spinal cord has this important role of connecting the body to the brain and the brain out to the body. Of course, extending off of the spinal cord, we get our spinal nerve. So we're going to be picking that up in a later conversation. As we think about processing and integration, remember we should consider this to be our gray matter. And because we're still in the central nervous system, we're going to talk about these processing centers as nuclei. And transmission, we should think about this as our white matter. Remember, it's white because of those myelinated axons. And so here, remember, we're still in the central nervous system. And so we talk about these collections of axons as tracts. Posted in the discussion, or the description rather, of the video, I have this image. So this is a photograph of a spinal cord model that we have in our laboratory. And you're seeing really a transverse cut through the spinal cord. And so we're able to see at the center, let's label the gray tissue that we see at the center of the spinal cord. So remember that this is a kind of cone-shaped overall structure, but when we look in the center, of the spinal cord, we see this gray tissue, and it's looking maybe like the letter H, or some folks like to describe it more as a butterfly. And so it looks like we have a body of the butterfly at the center connecting two sets of wings into the left and the right sides of the spinal cord. Now the wing analogy is nice because we have these sort of horns or projections that are sticking out, and we actually will be naming those. So we're going to be naming these horns or these projections. Now I will just also indicate for you that we're looking here at the anterior view, and we can talk more in the lab about how we know the front from the back. So as we're looking at these sort of horns on the wings of the butterfly, of this gray matter, we're going to talk about this front horn as the anterior gray horn. We're going to talk about the one to the side as the lateral gray horn. And we're going to talk about the one at the very back as the posterior gray horn. Then we're going to have a few other structures that we're going to be labeling as part of our lab work, but I'm going to stop this discussion of anatomy here in the lecture component so we can move on to the physiological piece. Now, what is significant about the gray matter? Remember, the significance of the gray matter is that this is where we're doing our processing. So gray matter, remember, this is processing or integration of information. So we will see that the spinal cord does have this significant role in processing some information. Also remember, we'll talk about gray matter in the central nervous system using the term nuclei. So nuclei is referring to processing center. Now, as we look at the posterior gray horn, we're going to see that this is going to be containing our sensory nuclei. So this means processing sense information as it comes from the body into the spinal cord. All of that information is coming into the back side of the spinal cord, and it is going to be processed at the posterior gray horn. Now we have two different processing centers here. We're going to have a visceral sensory nuclei. So here, visceral, I always in my mind translate this to guts. So this is sense information from the internal organs. So this is information like blood pressure, heart rate, calcium regulation, right? So calcium levels, gas levels, pH levels, all of this sort of information that ultimately becomes controlled or regulated by the autonomic nervous system. All of that sort of visceral sensory information is going to be processed by this particular collection of cell membrane, cell bodies. The other posterior gray horn sensory nuclei would be referred to as the somatic sensory nuclei, where soma means body. And so here, this is going to be the initial processing center for those general senses we talked about, like touch, pressure, vibration, pain, temperature. I think we mentioned itch. We mentioned tickle. We mentioned proprioception, right? That understanding of the position of our synovial joint, so the position of our body in space. This information is going to be coming in and being processed at the somatic sensory nuclei. All of that is in the posterior gray horn. Now, the anterior and the lateral gray horns are going to be receiving, will be directing out motor signals. So I'm going to say motor nuclei. And in fact, they're separate. So let's just go ahead for the anterior gray horn and say that it's going to contain the somatic motor nuclei, whereas the lateral gray horn will contain the visceral motor nuclei. And so remember, in the case of the anterior gray horn, this is somatic motor nuclei specifically. And we know, we just reminded ourselves that somatic means body. So this is the control of the skeletal muscle. These are the movements of our body, right? This is actually going to be where the cell body or the soma of the lower motor neuron will be located. So we read about the lower motor neuron as part of our chapter 12 study. And so we're going to talk about it again in the future. When we look at the lateral gray horn, we'll see that this is actually only going to be located in the thoracic and upper lumbar regions of the spinal cord. So the posterior gray horn is throughout the entire length. The anterior gray horn is throughout the entire length. The lateral gray horn is only in these specific regions. And so we can connect that to this idea that it contains the visceral motor nuclei. And remember, I, in my mind, always translate visceral to guts. So this is going to be controlling the cardiac muscle, which is located in the thoracic cavity. That's going to be in the heart. Smooth muscle, which we're going to see located in the organs in both thoracic and abdominopelvic cavities. And we'll see smooth muscle extending into the appendages in our blood vessels particularly. We'll also see this is the control of our glands and our adipose tissue. And hopefully you're getting the connection that this is the tissue that's being controlled by the autonomic nervous system. So the lateral gray horn, the visceral motor nuclei, is going to be this component of the autonomic nervous system. Specifically, we're going to see this sympathetic division. So what we're going to be learning in Anatomy 2, when we really focus in on the autonomic nervous system in a lot of detail, we'll see that the sympathetic division and the parasympathetic divisions, those nuclei are located in different places in the brainstem and spinal cord. And so we'll see that the sympathetic division, these neurons are going to be housed in these lateral gray horns. Okay, let's stop here with this video and pick up by looking at the white matter of the spinal cord in the next one. So stay tuned. As always, take care of yourselves and each other.